I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Bryant, the Executive Director of Bryant Research. Dr. Bryant is a social scientist and an expert in the field of all proteins, with a PhD in psychology from the University of Bath and an MSc in policy research from the University of Bristol. He brings a unique perspective to the challenges of our food systems.
Mention how much you
For his team at Bryant Research, Dr. Bryant collaborates with all system companies and animal protection nonprofits to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable and ethical food sources. As we'll hear today, his work dives into the social aspect of this transition, examining consumer behavior, policy implications, and the broader impacts of reducing animal product consumption. Dr. Bryant, thanks so much for being here, and feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Hey, well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to the class. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about social science for alternative proteins. So what we do at Bryant Research is a mix of things, including public opinion surveys and polling. We do focus groups. We do sort of expert interview-based projects, and as well as white papers and policy research and that kind of thing. All of our clients are in animal protection and or alternative proteins, so we work with a lot of animal non-profits, as well as cultivated meat, plant-based meat, and fermentation-derived animal product alternative companies. And yeah, like I said, our work spans the social sciences. So for those of you who are on this alternative proteins course but are not in sort of STEM subjects or biochemistry or chemical engineering or any of those sort of product-facing roles, this will be an interesting talk for you. So there's 4 parts of this that I'll talk about. I don't think, well, I'll probably take, maybe half an hour or the best part of an hour, and I'll leave lots of time for questions if you guys have them. I should mention as well, I am currently live streaming this to all of 9 viewers on my YouTube channel also. I started putting videos on YouTube earlier this year to try and get this kind of research just to have a bit more of a broad and sort of mainstream reach. So if you search on YouTube for Chris Bryant PhD, you will find the stream of this. So there you go. So yeah, 4 parts. First of all is consumer research, which I'll talk about. That's going to be mainly based on surveys. Then policy levers, where again we'll look at a bit of survey data on what kind of policies are popular and unpopular, as well as just some reasoning about how different policies work to nudge things in the direction of alternative proteins and away from animal products. Then third, we'll talk a little bit about intellectual property, patents, and how that plays into the world of alternative proteins. And finally, a few words on farming jobs. And as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that my slides there are most likely a little bit out of date, so we can have a little bit of discussion on that part off-piece, most likely. So consumer research, first of all, and yeah, like I said, I'll leave a bunch of time for questions at the end. Okay, so consumer research, first of all, this is a survey from the UK, which I conducted about 5 years ago, asking people what they thought of veganism. And you can see positive opinions represented in green bars here, neutral represented in yellow, and negative opinions represented in red bars. And if you see the areas where us vegans, tend to talk about the benefits the most to the environment in terms of ethics and morality and to human health, these are all areas where largely people already agree and have a positive opinion of veganism. I should say, by the way, this is a survey of 1,000 meat eaters in the UK, so we've specifically left out vegetarians and vegans from this. So it's asking meat eaters what they think about veganism. And most of them, over 50%, had a positive opinion in terms of the environmental, ethical, and health impacts. Where we see the more negative opinions, though, the majority of people having negative opinions of veganism in these red-dominated rows are with respect to being easy, convenient, enjoyable and tasty, and affordable. So this is very much a picture of agreement in principle and then barriers and problems in practice. Again, most people have a positive view and are basically in agreement that veganism is positive with respect to the main benefits that we talk about. And then the pragmatic, practical barriers is where there's more negative views. Nevertheless, we're seeing these barriers start to come down a little bit, and this is the major role of alternative proteins, where we've seen acceptance, or rather perceived quality of these products going up very rapidly in a recent period. So this is data from Belgium, and shows 44% of people here in blue finding plant-based meat alternatives to be acceptable. Or I guess this was, yeah, to what extent did it meet their needs, right? Fully or somewhat met their needs in 2019. And that number jumping to 51% in 2020. So quite a large jump in just 1 year. And this was really a period of these products improving and proliferating a lot. So we saw, you know, quite rapid progression in consumer perceptions during that time. One question that sometimes people ask, because I work with both cultivated meat and plant-based meat, and some people often ask something like, kind of, what's the point of one given the other, basically, right? As you know, they're kind of playing for the same market, aren't they? Here we can see crossed over consumer data according to whether they would eat cultivated meat and whether they are satisfied with plant-based meat. So you can see, first of all, we've got this 22% here in the bottom right who are both enthusiastic about plant-based and cultivated meat, right? So, you know, good for them, they're on board with both. But more interestingly, we've got these cells which add up to about 40% of consumers who basically have a positive attitude towards the one but not necessarily the other. So either they do like plant-based meat but not so keen on cultivated meat, that's about 25%, or they're not so keen on plant-based meat but they do like cultivated meat, and that's around 18%. And the ways in which consumers think about these kind of sets of products differ as well, where plant-based products are seen as being more appealing to vegetarians and flexitarian, you know, inclined consumers, and somewhat more appealing to females, and concerns being mainly about taste. Cultivated meats, on the other hand, shows actually, interestingly, a lot of these reversed, so tending to get more interest from meat eaters compared to vegetarians, and from men compared to women as well. And there are different sets of concerns, mainly centered around naturalness, and keen to see that these products are regulated effectively so that they can be guaranteed to be safe. So kind of diverging sets of consumer concerns for these different types of alt proteins. This is demonstrating a higher market share for plant-based products when they are at a lower price. So what we did here was had an experiment where people could choose between either buying plant-based patties, buying beef patties, or buying neither. The price of the beef patties is held steady at £3.50, and then the price of the plant-based patties is varied depending on their experimental condition. And you can see a higher proportion of people, up to 2/3, choosing the plant-based patties when they're at a significant discount compared to the beef patties, right? So that would have been £2.50 versus £3.50. You get 2/3 choosing the cheaper plant-based ones, right down to only 20% choosing them when they're significantly more expensive than the beef patties. And when they get more expensive, you see this effect that some people are dropping out of the market altogether, right? These are people who would be up for cheap plant-based patties, but when they get expensive, they don't switch to beef, they just drop out of the market. But importantly, they are also taking share from the beef patties, right? So at the expensive plant-based condition, we get 56% going for the beef patties, and that drops right down to 23% when the plant-based patties are nice and cheap. So getting the price down for these products is going to be really key. And that's, I would say, the big cause for optimism at the moment for the plant-based meat market is that the worldwide inflation, particularly in food, that has caused significant headwinds in the short term and been a real challenge for a lot of plant-based companies, has actually impacted animal products much more severely than it's impacted plant-based products. And you're increasingly now seeing different categories of plant-based foods where the plant-based one is for the first time cheaper than the animal product. This has not been the case historically, right? Vegan burgers are typically much more expensive than beef burgers, for example. And just now you're starting to see that coming more into alignment and starting to favor plant-based products. So messaging strategies, I think this is the last section on the consumer research bit. There's really two main lessons that I'll sort of focus on here. One is avoiding very prominent vegan sections and, very prominent vegan labels, as well as segregated vegan sections. So that goes for menus and also sort of sections of a supermarket. Here's survey data showing vegan right at the bottom of a list of what makes foods more appealing. From terms to do with fresh, farm fresh at the top of this list, and then at the bottom of this list, gluten-free diet, and then vegan. So it's well advised to use other terms instead. 100% plant-based is often used on these products so that they don't have vegan in the title. Here's a cool experiment where they have the vegetarian options either segregated in their own little vegetarian section, like you can see here on the right-hand menu, or mixed in with all of the other options and just indicated with a bit more of a subtle V logo, like you can see here on the left. And perhaps you can guess the punchline here. When you mix them in like that, as opposed to having them in their own segregated section, the choice of the vegetarian options more than doubles. So sectioning them off in their own little vegetarian bit, we get half the choice compared to mixing them in with the other options. The second lesson that I'll say on messaging strategies is to prefer taste-based messages over health-based messages. The main thing here of relevance for the plant-based category is all of this discourse about so-called ultra-processed food, which is, I don't think I have time to go into this here, but very misleading, especially with respect to plant-based alternatives, which tend to have a favorable nutritional profile compared to the meat that they're replacing, even though they're in this category called ultra-processed. And basically this category being kind of conflated and overly broad has led to a lot of confusion on that point. Nevertheless, plant-based products are a little bit wary of defending too hard on the health point, and here's some insights as why. When plant-based products in this experiment had a taste-focused label as opposed to a health-focused label, they were chosen between 2 and 3 times more frequently. And we see this occurring elsewhere. Here's compared to a basic label, you can increase selection by 25% if you have an indulgent label that focuses on the taste. But if you have a label that focuses on health benefits, either healthy restrictive, so that's things like low fat, or healthy positive, which is things like added vitamins, in both cases, you actually get lower selection than just a basic label that doesn't mention health at all. So there seems to be some kind of inference going on where consumers see that or think that's right, healthy, it's low fat, it's low salt, it's low sugar, means not going to be that tasty, right? So health-based messages are to be used with caution. This is the ultimate example of that, where you have a drink which is labeled as either healthy or unhealthy. It's the same drink, and in the experimental condition where it's labeled as healthy, it's rated over about 2 points out of 10 lower enjoyable rating than in the condition where it's labeled unhealthy, right? Simply labeling it as unhealthy made it appear to be some sort of treat, and therefore people rated it as more enjoyable. All right, that's the end of the consumer research section. Like I said, I think that's the longest of the 4. Perhaps it's a good idea for me to stop at the end of each section to invite questions if anyone has them. And if not, I will be happy to steam on. But are there any questions in the room?
Yes, we have one question.
We have more than one question. We have one question to start. Chris didn't say, where is Bryant Research located? And are these surveys European in nature, and some of them are maybe a couple of years old, does he think they change? Oh, and you probably know the answer to some of these.
Yes, good question. Yeah, so we're in the UK, and a lot of these are UK surveys. This is US, this is UK. I think these are UK also. So a lot of these will be UK, but we do see generally the patterns, while the numbers might be kind of different, we generally see the patterns being pretty similar across the UK and US. But yeah, that's a good question.
And has it changed any, have the trends changed any recently, in the last couple of years, or is it pretty stable?
Yes, it has. It has been actually kind of a tough few years for the plant-based sector. I think this has been a mix of ultra-processed discourse and also economic conditions. I think the economic conditions are the most interesting part of it, because there has been, in the UK, and I think similar in the US, has been a couple of years out of the last 4 that have been really rampant inflation, like double digits food inflation. And there's this kind of interesting situation where the plant-based products are more expensive currently. And so in a situation where now your food bill is pressed and there's pressure on you to cut things, it's not surprising that you see some of that getting dropped off the more expensive category. But the rate of inflation change is so much lower. I don't have it in this, but there's a great graph showing beef, chicken, and pork all in like double digits inflation sometime in 2021, and plant-based products like close to zero or even below. So although they were starting out from a much higher price point, that gap has been shrinking a lot during this inflationary period, and I think there's going to be a real advantage in the long term, because it'll get to a point where there's any kind of animal or environmental pitch aside, you can save 15% on your grocery bill if you switch to plant-based products, right? That's a different pitch entirely.
I have to ask one more, and then I'll turn it over to whoever I've had the question. Why? Why has that been, why the reversal there?
Yeah, really good question. It basically comes down to agricultural inputs. So essentially, if you're making like a plant-based alternative from soy and the price of soy goes up, you think, well, that's no good. The price of our main ingredient's gone up. But animals are consuming soy in much larger quantities per calorie produced than plant-based products. So it's much more efficient to use that directly. A big thing that happened obviously in Europe with Russia invading Ukraine, that put a lot of pressure on wheat prices. Again, wheat is like a main ingredient for a lot of these plant-based alternatives, and so you would think, okay, that's bad news, but it's a main ingredient of feed. And so although plant-based products, some of them did get a little bit more expensive in that time, the animal equivalents got like 5 times more expensive in the same time.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from the class now. Go ahead.
I saw a little bit of a silly question, but I saw in the soda question, the average was about a 4 rating. So what soda did you use for it to be rated?
That's right. Yeah. So this was actually, I happen to know the answer to this. So I was looking at this paper today. The drink was a mango lassi.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, I like that one. Yeah, it was a mango lassi, and it was just simply either labeled healthy or unhealthy. I don't know. Maybe people thought the unhealthy version was a cocktail or something. Who knows?
Good question.
Going back to like the one study where like just generally not using like vegetarian and vegan and using more like plant-based and that sort of thing. Why do you think there's such a bias against like putting this is a vegetarian product or this is a vegan product on like on products that are vegetarian and vegan? Why is it better to say plant-based or fresh?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well. And I do have some other slides sort of showing this point. I'm realizing I should have amalgamated these a bit better. I think that one of the big things is because it is describing the food, but it is also the name of an identity which you might have or not have. So like gluten-free food being described as celiac food probably would make that even less appealing, right? Because it means the same thing. It just means it doesn't have gluten in it. But it's now called the name of some group that I might think, well, I'm not celiac, so that's not for me, basically. I think that's the main thing that's going on. It's because it's describing the food, but it's also the name of some group, which if I'm not part of that group, then I feel like, well, that's not for me. That's the best I can describe it.
Can you go back to the slide where there was like a difference between female and male consumers? I think it was like earlier on.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you think like the gender, like do you think amongst people who are like more favoring vegetarian versus like more favoring like traditional meat, do you think like the gender proportion is a little like, I don't know, uneven, like unequal?
Yes, for sure. When you look at like strict meat avoiders, I think it's about 2/3 or even 3/4 female. In terms of like vegetarians, here we're talking about like, these gender differences referenced in these slides are only like quite slight, whereby plant-based products are like, what is it? They're slightly more, if you're female, you're slightly more likely to say that you prefer them than if you're male. whereas the reverse is true for cultivated meat. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. You might see cultivated meat. This is meat grown from animal cells being able to capture more of the male high meat attachment market than the plant-based sector has been able to capture. I think that's probably something we'll see in the next few years.
The class.
Any more questions? We'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Bryant.
Awesome. Well, I'll kick on if there are no more questions at this stage.
Yep, I think we're all good.
Good stuff. Okay, cool. So we'll talk a bit about policy levers next. I think this is another longish section, and then the last two are relatively short. So the first section is about meat alternatives there mainly, and consumer research. This is about policies. So what people are voting for, what would people vote for or vote against in terms of policies designed to curtail animal product consumption. Here we've got them ordered from the number of people who support at the top to a high number of people opposing the policy at the bottom. So blue representing support here, yellow representing opposition. And you can see the most popular policy by far is improving on-farm animal welfare standards, which over 90% in this UK sample were in favour of improving on-farm animal welfare standards. We'll talk a bit about how that works, but just to let that sink in, kind of how much more well supported this one is compared to really any of the others, right? The second most well supported is adding animal welfare labels to meat products. So again, it's very sympathetic to animal welfare related things. Is really striking how high public support is for animal welfare, outside of obligation to kind of change one's diet, right? People are very on board with pro-animal measures in general. So those are the most well supported, and then you can see at the bottom of this list we've got the least well supported policies. A 20% tax on meat. This was only approved by 16% of people, with nearly 70% opposing. And then restricting advertisements for meat products is also another measure that actually, to me, this was kind of surprising how poorly supported that was. I wouldn't have thought that's quite so objectionable, but there we go. Only 27% in favour of that versus 38% opposing. So we can look at some of these policies in a little bit more detail, starting out with taxes and subsidies, just because I think this is where most people kind of default to in terms of policy interventions. It's like the most obvious thing that you can reach for is change the price of the thing that we want people to do more or less of, right, with taxes or subsidies. So as we've seen, animal product taxes are very politically unpopular. If you ask about meat tax or taxes on animal products, people sense and understand this means that my food's going to get more expensive, and they don't want that to happen. So there's been various different framings of a similar thing, imposing a tax versus rescinding tax exemptions or reducing subsidies. So in a lot of places, in Germany, for example, they have a reduced rate of VAT chargeable to meat. So I think the standard VAT is 19%, and then meat is charged at 7% or something like that. And they're looking at, or they may have done it already now actually, rescinding that VAT exemption so that it kind of brings it up to level with other non-meat products. So it's effectively a tax increase, but it's not framed as such. There are also these kind of proxy taxes that might be done on measures which affect meat more so than plant foods. So, for example, a tax on carbon produced by food or on saturated fat, which will tend to disproportionately affect red meat in both cases. And it's notable that in these cases, these could actually backfire on animal welfare. There's something called the small body problem, where basically there is much higher, many more units of animal suffering per kilogram of food when it comes to chicken, fish, and eggs, i.e. products which come from small animals, of which you need very many to produce the same amount of food, compared to red meat and dairy, which come from large-bodied animals. You need relatively few of them to produce the same amount of food. So these proxy taxes for saturated fat or for food carbon, I'm a little bit on the fence about them, because they can be, they may cause a situation where overall animal suffering increases if they nudge more people towards small-bodied animals. On the other side of the coin, though, while animal product taxes are very politically unpopular, alternative protein subsidies are far more popular. So, you know, making the food cheaper rather than making the food more expensive, that's well supported and perhaps not surprising. But overall, there's a strong case for leveling the playing field, right? There should at least be level, if not favorable, tax rates for plant-based products compared to animal products. It's ridiculous. In many European markets, it is the case that the tax on plant-based products is at a higher rate than on animal products, as is the case in Germany, and you know, is similar in other places in Europe. So the next policy lever I'll talk about is regulating animal production, and this is, you'll recall, the most well-supported measure, which is improving on-farm animal welfare standards, right? Increasing things like stocking density, minimum stocking density, having other sort of standards that you must meet if you're in the business of farming animals. This is survey data from the UK on the acceptability of various different farming practices. You can see in blue the percentage who find these practices to be acceptable, in red the percentage who find them to be unacceptable, in yellow the percentage who are not sure. And the main point here is just to, again, absorb between 75 and 95% of people find all of these common animal farming practices to be unacceptable in the UK. So there's strong support for increased animal protections, and when you get into the details of what actually happens to animals on farms, cutting tails off newborn pigs, keeping pigs in cages where they can't turn around for weeks on end, cutting off the beaks off newborn chicks, killing newborn male calves, and so on, the overwhelming majority of people say these practices are not acceptable. So increasing animal welfare standards is well supported, therefore. Now, just to look at what we're doing with animal welfare standards when we do this in terms of the quantity of those animal products being supplied. This is a supply and demand curve whereby you can think of this as very high prices, there's very low quantity demanded. And then as the price comes down, there's very high quantity demanded, right? Everyone thinks it's very cheap. No one thinks it's very expensive. And then you have the opposite going on with supply, right? So when the price is very high, everyone wants to sell and make and supply the things. There's a high price, you can get a lot of money for it. And when the price is very low, nobody wants to supply the things, you can't get a lot of money for it, right? So opposite directions for supply and demand. They meet at this point called the equilibrium. And where these curves meet, that determines what the price is going to be and what is going to be the quantity of that thing produced. So if we're looking at this from a meat reduction perspective, what we are looking for is this quantity here to go down. So we want to create conditions that are going to cause a lower quantity of meat to be produced and consumed. And there's a couple of ways of doing this. So the first, where we are trying to impact consumer decisions, and we can think about that first section on consumer research with all the different framings and language that you should use and so on. We're trying to move down this curve. So we're trying to say we want there to be a lower level of demand at any given price. So at this price, formerly there was this much demand, now there's going to be this much demand. Formerly there was this much, now there's going to be this much, right? So we're moving down the demand curve. And when we do that successfully, we run a successful Go Vegan campaign or whatever it may be, we arrive at a new equilibrium. So we actually get a lower price in this case, but we also get a lower quantity produced. So we've moved down that demand curve, we get a lower equilibrium now, and we've reduced the quantity being produced. So that's what we want. Another way of achieving this reduction in quantity is moving up the supply curve. And this is what we're doing when we regulate animal production. we're saying for any given quantity of animals farmed, the price of doing that is now going to be higher. There's going to be more stringent standards to be met, and therefore it's pushing up the supply curve, right? And again, you can see when that happens, we get a change in the point where the two curves intersect, and we get actually this time an increase in the price and a decrease in the quantity consumed, because that supply curve's been shifted upwards. So I mainly include this for animal people who are inclined to oppose welfare improvements. If you're not an animal person, that might seem a strange thing to exist. If you are an animal person, you'll either be one of them or rolling your eyes along with me. But yes, certain animal people don't like the idea of animal welfare standards because they feel it's some form of appeasement or something like that, right? Or saying it's acceptable if the cage is only big enough. The point here is to say there is actually going to be a reduction in the quantity of animals being farmed as well, and that's something that I think is often missed in this kind of intervention. So next we'll talk about labelling as part of policy, and this is a animal welfare labelling scheme proposed by the UK government. We're kind of overdue some news on how likely this is to be adopted, but this would be a big improvement on where we are currently. We can see this is the top level, and then it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Very clear ordinal system that is proposed to be applied to poultry and pork products. We already have some mandatory welfare labelling for eggs. And importantly, this is going to replace, or I guess at first exist alongside, this kind of hodgepodge range of different certifications which mean slightly different things but all look quite similar in their colour and shape and design. There's a similar thing that I could show you in the US. I think that you guys have even more different Humane America and Humane Standard and all these different things which are quite similar but mean different things. It's designed to be confusing. It really is designed to be confusing, right? With many more of these things existing, some of these are made by the livestock industries. With many more of these things existing, it makes it hard to keep track of. Even people who are extremely motivated can't tell you the difference between the different humane labels available, right? Which is, of course, exactly the point. And so it's incredibly important to have a clear ordinal system that applies to all animal products. The other thing with these opt-in standards, they're privately paid certification schemes, first of all, right? So if you are paying the certifying body, they don't really have an incentive to come and inspect your farm and rescind your certification if you're not meeting the standards, because you'll stop paying them. So there's kind of a perverse economic incentive there. And there's also this situation where there are only welfare labels on products which meet some welfare standard and want to demonstrate that and show that off. But there are not any welfare labels on the lowest welfare products. They just don't disclose any welfare information, right? If there's no news on that, it's probably bad news. And you can imagine a world where it's optional to disclose the health information of different products. And you can think about, the cake aisle in your supermarket, and all of the cake manufacturers say, well, this is great. It's now optional to disclose our nutritional profiles. And since our cakes are not particularly healthy, we're going to take the option to not disclose that. Right, so you're going to walk down the cake aisle. Now, some cake manufacturers, maybe the raisin loaves or whatever, will be relatively healthy and have some good labels. Maybe they can put a healthy label on there. All of the other cakes which are unhealthy are not going to have a label, and you're going to be in this situation where you're going to walk down the cake aisle, you're going to only see green traffic lights or whatever the equivalent system is, and you're going to come out and think, cakes are pretty healthy. Right, so these are all kind of problems with this like hodgepodge of private certifications that we have in the UK and in the US currently. And this is all a good case for moving towards mandatory welfare labels, which are ordinal, which are clear, and which have to apply whether or not it's good news, right? The thing about this system, they're going to have a lot of products with a red number 5 label on them who really don't want it, right? The animal industries are pushing back hard against this. Similarly, and with a little more traction, it seems, although not more support in our survey. Notably, we had actually higher support for animal welfare labels compared to carbon labels, which you can see here was just about 49%. But some of these eco labels on food are a little further along in terms of their development. Another last point on labeling is to do with animal product alternatives, and this is sort of a perennial fight that the plant-based industry is in about whether or not they can use certain terms in their packaging. So this is cocoa dairy free, but it's not a milk alternative or says milk anywhere on this packaging. This product was called This Is Not Milk, and I believe has had to, you don't see this in the supermarkets anymore. I think they had to change that because the dairy industry was concerned that people might think this is milk. And of course we have This Isn't Chicken, which again we are just waiting for the industry, the poultry industry, to say this is misleading, that this is chicken. So that's another thing where regulators can have, exercise a bit of common sense on these labels for plant-based products. Interestingly, different jurisdictions appear to lean different directions with respect to how sensible they in fact are on these things. And the last point I'll say on policy levers, which is sort of something that can be implemented in public catering or incentivized in private catering settings, is nudges, so sort of behavioral architecture changes to move people more towards plant-based products. This is an increase in selection of vegetarian options when they're positioned first in a buffet. So when people fill up their trays with a vegetarian option already, they get to the meat option later on and they're less likely to choose it. Here we can see increased selection of a vegetarian option when vegetarian options make up the majority of a menu. So we get up to 50% selection when veg options are 75% of the menu, from only 25% selection when they're 25% of the menu. And the biggest, most consistent nudge that we have is defaults in settings where there is a default choice, moving from a situation where the default is meat and you have to request the vegetarian option to a situation where the default is vegetarian, you have to request the meat option, can result in these massive increases in selection of the vegetarian option. This is especially good for if you're organizing events or conferences and things like this. People have to choose their food selection in advance. Setting a default where most people just stick with the default whether or not it's meat or vegetarian. Okay, so that's the end of the policy levers section. How are we doing for time? Not too bad. I'll pause here if there's any questions. And yeah, like I say, the last two sections I have here are a bit shorter.
I had a question about the labeling section. I think that's super interesting to me. Is there any research that backs that increased labeling or increased information affects consumer choice?
Yeah, it's a fair question. There is, honestly, some of the research I've seen on this suggests that the effect is like somewhat modest, where even when these kind of labels are added, there's not a huge effect on food choice. But I think it's important in the longer term, and things which wouldn't necessarily be captured by choice experiment studies, for this information to be known, for people to notice, oh, look at this, actually you can see that most of the food options I have available to me are like the lowest welfare standard. I think that kind of creates an environment in which people are more likely to move towards those options in the longer term, even though that might not be collected so much in the short-term experiments.
Is there like policy coming forward now about these sort of labeling regulations and things like that, or is this more of like a hypothetical ideal situation?
Yeah, in the UK, these labels on the left are actually being considered currently by the government. So this has been in consultation for a couple of years. And this top level one is the sort of picture that they've given as an example. And then I've inferred that the next four are going to be, these colors, but who knows what this picture is going to look like on the number 5, right? It's like some factory farm cartoon. But yeah, so this is being considered currently, and well, I feel like I've been saying this for a few years at this point, but hopefully we know more soon.
So on this slide, when you're discussing like the new labels, I don't think, at least I don't have the context of what current UK labels look like. So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so these labels that you can see on the right-hand side are various different privately administered things, and these are all different schemes. So these are not necessarily like ordinarily organized. Now, the details of this, I think this Soil Association Organic is in fact the highest welfare, the highest set of standards out of these. Then RSPCA is significantly better than legal minimums. And Red Tractor is, my understanding, this is the main one that the livestock industry in the UK have basically made up, and is, I think, in most animal products, actually no different from the legal minimum. It just restates the legal minimum, like stocking density and other standards that they have, and consumers naively think, well, these all look roughly the same, and so if I see the Red Tractor, that's good enough for me. And it is this kind of situation where most consumers are wanting to believe that there's good news. So it's really rife for this kind of misleading, sort of misleading marketing. But from the producer's perspective as well, let's say that one of these labels, I'm really going to have to do something different. I'm going to have to refit my barns, and I'm going to have more space per chicken, and it's going to cost more, and so on. And one of them, I'm not really going to have to change anything, and I get almost the same effect from consumers just assuming it's fine. But there's no wonder that most people go towards the one where they don't really have to do anything, right?
Like you've been saying that the government has been considering the more universal or mandatory labels for a couple years. Is there like some sort of pushback or like, I don't know, really big pushback for why they wouldn't be considered, or why they didn't just start out with like one universal label in the first place?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's plenty of lobbying against it from the animal industries, because they realize that, hey, if we have to start putting red number 5s on our factory farmed products, people are going to realize that's like most of our products. So they go to the same meetings that I go to, and sit on the other side of the room and lobby for the opposite things that I lobby for. Basically, they do have cynical livestock industry organizations to have people turn up and say, well, why don't we make this optional and try and water it down and stuff like this. And I mean, it's, on one level it's quite shocking that that goes on, but on another level it's entirely predicted and predictable, because of course, right, this is an industry just trying to defend itself and ensure that its costs don't go up, and of course they're going to send people to the meetings and try and undermine the animal welfare standards if it's going to mean they make less money. So there really is like some cynical lobbying against this kind of thing that goes on. And then as to why this isn't like the default, or why it doesn't start that way, I guess that it is like an evolution of public interest, or like maybe more demonstration that there's public interest. It didn't start this way just because we haven't always done factory farming, right? Factory farming is less than 100 years old. So 100 years ago, there wouldn't have even been that pressing a need to have something like this, because, well, they were all just sort of backyard animals, right? Whereas now there is such a difference between the number 5 factory farms, the number 1 sort of backyard free range, whatever it may be, that there is more of a range to exist in. And then the other part of that, I think that these certification schemes, the privately administered ones, although there's lots of problems with them, I do think they're better than nothing that these kind of things exist. And one of the reasons for that is because they establish some sort of levels of what might be a reasonable stocking at density, right? The RSPCA, for example, have already been having these conversations for several years when setting their standards, and so then when it comes time to saying, okay, we're now going to make it mandatory and we're now going to have the government mandated labels, there's already some numbers that different organizations have used, and there's already been some thinking about, okay, exactly how's this going to be implemented and measured and so on. So yeah, I think that it's moving more towards mandatory labels. There's a couple of other countries which are going in this direction as well. I think Germany again have already or are doing something along these lines. But yeah, the mandatory standards are really a world of different from the privately administered opt-in, similar but different looking certification schemes that we have currently.
I had a question about the last slide where you mentioned like defaulting to the vegetarian option.
Mm.
So like I feel like there is definitely some like potential for like criticism in the sense that some people would like maybe feel scammed, you know, if they got a vegetarian default when they expected vegan stuff. There's gonna be some negative feedback. And I was wondering if there was like a range of years you think where like the positive outcome would like, you know, overdo the negative outcome. Like obviously long term would be better, but in the short term it could be like bad, right? So what's like the time range that we're thinking of?
Yeah, I see what you mean. There is certainly default's kind of an interesting one because there's so many situations where there isn't really a default, right? You're just kind of choosing from this list of options. There's a lot of situations where there isn't really a default, and in the experiments on the defaults, they really vary in their kind of setup. There's one where you sit down and you're given a vegetarian option and you're told, you know, if you want a meat option, you can go and look at the meat menu that's on the wall over there, right? So there's a whole other element of have to get up and, you know, it's in front of other people and so on. So there's kind of different ways that this could be implemented. There was, for a while, Burger King in Austria would ask customers, did they want normal or with meat? And that, you know, that was one way of presenting a default option. When people would order whatever burger they're having, they would have the vegetarian option or the meat option. Do you want normal or with meat? So in most cases, you know, the consumer is going to be aware of the fact that they're getting a vegetarian thing by default. And the nice thing about defaults is, you know, as with nudges, one of the key features of nudges is meant to be that you're not forcing the choice, right? You're not saying, okay, the menu is just 100% vegetarian. You have to have vegetarian, like it or not. So you can get, you know, for people who are really going to grumble about it, this 13%, they can still go and swerve from the default and get their meat. But for most people, just that setting of the default, maybe there's an element of the social expectation that comes with that, is enough to just make them stick with it, basically.
I think that's all the questions for this section, so we'll hand it back over to you.
Awesome. Okay, guys, I'll whip through the last couple of sections. I do have a hard stop at 9, unfortunately, so I'll get through these quickly. Or, well, at the hour, I should say. It's not 9 for you guys. Okay, so intellectual property. This is an interesting one because here we have an industry in alternative proteins where some of the leaders of the companies, here's Uma Valetti from Upside Foods and Josh Tetrick from Eat Just, as well as the big investors, including Jeremy Collar and Jim Mellon. These are two British guys who are big investors in alternative proteins. And what these four have in common is that they are all vegetarians or vegans, and they're mission-driven people. And you'll find this as a common feature across a lot of alternative protein companies in both the leadership and the actual owners and the investors are mission-driven vegetarians and vegans. So nonetheless, we have the concept of a patent, which is, you know, protection of intellectual property within a certain company. When they invent something new, they're going to get normally a 20-year monopoly for producing it. And this is a good system insofar as it incentivizes research and innovation. Right, we can. It's worthwhile to put money into coming up with new stuff if we know that if we're successful, we're going to have a 20-year monopoly. We're going to be able to make money off it. But on the downside, you know, in the immediate sense, it kind of restricts progress to be slower than it could be if everyone could just use each other's inventions. Right, you're in this situation now where you're restricting competition, granting one company a 20-year monopoly on the technology. And so, although it's kind of needed in the first place to make the innovation happen, it's not great that it slows down the diffusion of the innovation to other companies by granting that research, by granting that monopoly. And it might be also restricting further research and further iterations on your fantastic invention and concept because your competitors can't use it in their testing. On the plus side, though, patents are basically a tool for giving companies, or one of the things that they are, a tool for giving companies access to investment capital, right? If you have a unique patent, you're going to be able to then access capital to make it happen, which you might not be able to ever make it happen if you don't have a patent for your idea. And it also then makes the technology public after the 20-year period elapses, which is unlike trade secrets. Trade secrets are not patents, and are just things which not very many people know. The secret ingredient in Coca-Cola, right, is not patented. Is just not known by very many people. And I'm sure there's all sorts of NDAs and stuff like that around it as well, right? But there's no mechanism for saying, okay, 20 years after Coca-Cola come up with it, it's now public. No, it's just, you don't know what it is, tough tits, right? So that's one advantage of the patent system. There's a couple of examples where companies have come up with really beneficial technologies and then just made them open to the public. Volvo invented the 3-point seatbelt. They could have had a 20-year monopoly on cars with seatbelts, and they decided not to. They decided to make it open. And any manufacturer were allowed to use them. They diffuse very quickly, and now all cars have 3-point seatbelts. Likewise, Tesla, with their electric vehicle patents, making them open, making them accessible to all car manufacturers. And notably in this latter case, right, there's definitely some infrastructural advantages to faster diffusion of electric vehicles, right? And a lot of Tesla's value comes from their battery networks and stuff like that, their charging networks, and is sort of codependent on enough people having electric cars. So there could be some commercial incentives for actually opening up patents like that as well. So we looked in this paper that we have coming out on this shortly at 4 forms of intellectual property sharing. One is altruistic patent sharing, where companies just straight up say, here's our patent, we could enforce this, but we're not going to, and now it's open and anyone can use it. A second one, which is a promising avenue, I think, for alternative proteins, is sharing what did not work, sharing kind of close failures. If you're a cultivated meat company and you have something which didn't quite come off and maybe you've spent a lot of time and resources in experimenting with, clearly it's a great value for the rest of the cultivated meat industry if you share that so that others don't have to waste their time and resources on the same thing. A third is patent salvaging. So this is where you have companies going under and other companies acquiring their intellectual property. There was a period where the alternative proteins investment market was really booming and a lot of companies were able to acquire capital. And now some of those companies have fallen by the way, and some of them nonetheless have valuable intellectual property that others might want to come in and take advantage of and acquire, meaning that those investors can still get some return on that as well. And the fourth and sort of most interesting that we came across in this section was benevolent patent extensions. There's a phrase to Google if you are into this sort of area. Basically, the idea here is that companies with socially beneficial patents will be incentivized to make them open in exchange for extensions to other unrelated patents. So if you have a patent on, for example, cultivated meat, and we say, hey, that's really socially beneficial, it'd be great if you could open that up. In exchange, we're going to give you some extension to your patent on, you know, iPhone chargers or whatever, like commercial but non benefiting the world inventions you might have. And essentially then that allows you to get value from something that's not going to be socially beneficial by sharing something that is going to be socially beneficial. So that's benevolent patent extensions. Give that a Google if that is interesting to you. It's a very new concept that requires a whole legal framework and everything, but it's going off. So last section here, and I don't have enough time to do this justice really, but it's only a short one. there's this idea that meat production is supporting agricultural jobs, and that if we reduce meat production, that will reduce agricultural jobs. But that's actually not what has been observed. This is between 2000 and 2019. We saw a 15% decrease in the number of people employed in agriculture worldwide, even though we saw a 46% increase in total meat production. So we were producing more meat than ever, and we had fewer people than ever employed in agriculture. Here's survey data from France and Germany, where we saw a higher percentage of those working in the meat industry identifying as meat avoiders compared to people who did not work in the meat industry. I'm really racing through now in the last 3 minutes, but I'll share these slides so you can see this in more detail. Farming jobs are often an important part of family tradition and identity, are often occupied by people with lower than average education and limited proximity to other employment. And often people have not only their job, but actually substantial investments in animal farming equipment, animal farms, and so on. And so for these various reasons, it can be quite challenging for farmers themselves to move out of this into alternative fields. One thing, or there's a couple of things here, 3 things that we can agree on, right? Us meat reduction folks and meat producing folks, is restricting imports of low welfare animal products. We have in the UK a situation where there is relatively high welfare standards for producing animals, but you can get cheap animal products imported from places with no welfare standards. And that's not fair on the animals, it's not fair on consumers, and it's not fair on farmers in Britain who do have to meet those higher welfare standards. Implementing mandatory standardized animal welfare labeling, as we discussed, would be obviously good for animals, and it would also be good for farmers, because again, the majority of these farming jobs, which have been wiped out by factory farms, would have been somewhat protected if there's some way for high welfare farmers to essentially capture the added value from those higher welfare products via standardized labeling. But they can't do that if factory farm products can just obfuscate and appear to be high welfare. And preparing farmers for the alternative protein value chain. So this is things like producing cultivated meat media ingredients and or ingredients for making plant-based meat. And there's all sorts of opportunities that can be available for farmers there. Finishing almost exactly on the hour. This is links to my slides. You can find all of this at tinyurl.com/socscialtproteins, as in social science alternative proteins. tinyurl.com/socscialtproteins if you want to find these graphs and references and so on. And thank you guys so much for inviting me to speak. And I'm afraid I don't have time for final questions, but you can email me at chris@bryantresearch.co.uk. Thank you again so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Bryant. We really enjoyed your presentation.
Yeah, we'll look you up on YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll watch the videos.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely. All right. I'll see you there. Thanks so much, guys.